Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your bank of knowledge of investment, economics, and geopolitics. Go to goldnewsletter.com for our publications and archives.
This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. Always pleased to be with you. If you want to go see the archives, go to goldnewsletter.com/podcast. And if you have not already, be sure to subscribe. YouTube, SoundCloud, BitChute, wherever you are. We're eager to have people subscribe and also give us feedback. As I said, I always love doing these shows because we get just brilliant, thoughtful people on to chat. And today we've got a gentleman whom I have been following for who knows how long. I mean, too many years. And I think I saw your article originally on LewRockwell.com many years ago.
Sure.
And maybe you're on the LewRockwell.com podcast about the word liberalism, but his name is James Ostrowski, and he is an author and lawyer based in Buffalo, New York. He's written 7 books, and he promotes direct citizen action in politics, and he is looking to promote a post-Ron Paul campaign, because we are, I guess, in the post-Ron Paul era. And the book we're going to discuss today is on progressivism, what this means. And this is particularly relevant. People who've been listening to the show will know that ESG, or environmental social governance criteria, has creeped right into the financial sector. You can hardly read a financial publication without seeing ESG in the first page or two. And so what is this progressivism? How has it become so prominent and powerful in the land of the free? We have the man, Jim, to tell us. So, Jim, please hold up your book and
Sure.
Let's roll. Progressivism.
Yeah.
A primer on the idea. What was the subtitle to that one?
I'm sorry. Pulling my book down too fast.
A primer on the idea destroying America.
Yeah. And people thought I was exaggerating. And I'd like to think that some of the things I actually said, I don't know why I'm smiling, but I'd like to think that some of the things I said have actually turned out true. I mean, specifically, I predicted some of the racial unrest back. The book was published in 2014. I wrote the manuscript before the Ferguson riots. The book came out a couple months later, but I kind of predicted and maybe explained that. But you mentioned Ron Paul. I was active on both of his campaigns, and he did a tremendous job, and he's obviously the hero of the movement. But I was concerned that after his campaign, that we needed to come up with sort of a new way to define the movement, approach the movement, come up with some new strategies, because he worked so hard and had tremendous support, and he had a financial base as well. But I think he got 11% of the vote, and I'm not saying he didn't do well. He did extremely well, but obviously I thought we've got a philosophical problem. So we're only getting 1 out of 10 people. So what is this? What do these other 90% believe? What is the ideology and you and I both know that both parties have it, and that's documented in the book. So what is that mindset? What is that ideology? I prefer the word mindset, but I'm not hung up on the word. It's an ideology. It's a philosophy. And I thought, well, I think I kind of knew. I kind of knew what it was. I've been thinking about it for a long time. And okay, now what do we call that philosophy? Because that's important. Because as we were chatting before, if you don't have a word for what you're for, how are you going to convince people to come along with you? And if you can't label, people talk about labels. I love labels. Every word is a label. That's how we communicate concepts with people. If you don't have a concept for what you're against, how can you explain it to people who are for you or against you? So basically, I said, well, I think the best word for the predominant view in America for many, many decades, really almost going back 100 years, is progressivism. And I'm using that as small p. In other words, it represents an idea or concept. There's obviously the capital P progressive era, which is, back 1900 to 1920 or whenever, I guess that ended when Warren Harding got elected by most historians' account. So progressivism, I didn't want to call it liberalism. Why? Because liberalism really in the old days meant something like libertarian, and the left wing kind of stole the term from us, and it's very confusing. But for 40 years, people haven't even been using the word liberal. So I said, well, let's maybe at some point steal that word back. And I know Richard Ebeling and several other people in the movement agree with me on that eventually I think we should call ourselves liberal, but maybe not at this particular time. So I said, well, what is that mindset? I'm going to call it progressivism. And then in the book, very early on in the book, I said, well, what is progressivism? I mean, it's funny. I sat down, I planned the book, and I met with a local progressive Democrat. And I said, I'm writing a book about progressivism. And he said, what's progressivism? And I quote that conversation in the book because I think there's a lot of confusion about what it is. I do draw a distinction between leftism and progressivism. We can get into that a little later, but the one sentence definition, the progressive believes that for any problem that comes along, there's sort of a governmental solution, and that's a very strong presumption. And so I think I'm using progressivism in one of its mainstream uses. For example, unemployment insurance. It's a classic progressive policy. We're going to solve the problem of people who lose their jobs and need some cash by making government bigger. We're going to tax people more. We're going to take more of their money, and we're going to spend it for unemployment insurance. So that's just an obvious example of the progressive use of government to, they think, improve human life. I do discuss that issue, the unemployment, in the book. It's one of my examples of a progressive policy which I think fails. Ultimately, I'm a trial lawyer. I'm an appellate lawyer. I've got a philosophy degree and studied a little economics under Murray Rothbard. So I like to pick apart things and break it down and come up with kind of like a checklist. So at some point in the book, I can't remember the pages, there's like an 8-part checklist for this is what progressivism is. And the progressive will probably agree with some of it, and they'll say, well, I don't really agree with that. But some of the key features of progressivism is that, and this has sort of been talked about for years in our movement, but it had to be stated explicitly. And I think we see that particularly in the last year. Progressives have no theory of costs. I mean, the Austrians, the libertarians, and Chicago School, or people in money, we're always talking about cost. The progressive has no theory of cost. And a quick example, I used the example of Social Security. And I pointed out that 8, 10, 9 times they raised the Social Security tax. Well, at no point during that process did anybody in really either party say, I wonder if this is costing too much. No, it was always understood we have to save Social Security at all costs. And even Ronald Reagan participated in raising the Social Security tax. So they have no theory of cost. There's no limiting principle to it. If you understand, if you accept my definition, where's the limiting principle? There isn't one. So these are some of the elements that I think do explain a lot of the things that are happening now.
Yeah, to me, this obviously makes sense that I'm a foreigner in the United States, and I can let you people know that I've now been awarded a green card, so will be a permanent resident once all that bureaucracy is taken care of. But
Excellent.
I am a foreigner in the United States, and it seems obvious to me that there's a grave disconnect in this country between as you said, the mindset of a large majority of people and those in Washington, D.C., of course, it's almost 100%, and the actual spirit or tradition of this country.
Oh, sure.
And I just find that very confusing. And maybe because I'm a foreigner, I can see that disparity more clearly than local people, because I feel like there's this America that we dream about, or I dream about, and then this monstrosity that is just nothing of the sort.
Right.
So how do you want to talk about how this basically anti-American mindset became the predominant one in this country?
Well, That's a big historical question. I delve into it a little bit in the book, but basically, what we call libertarianism or classical liberalism. I follow Rothbard's thinking on this, that because he was a historian and I'm more of an amateur historian, that this all sort of starts in about 1650 with the levelers in England. It goes through Locke, and Jefferson is heavily influenced by them and writes the Declaration. And with the obvious flaws that we all know about, it was the founding of a relatively classical liberal country in 1776. And we didn't even have a constitution at that time. And that's a big debate. Some of the libertarians are a little skeptical of the Constitution. We thought it made government too big. And I think it probably turned out to be correct. But more or less for about 100 years, in spite of the interruption of the Civil War, which temporarily spiked, as all wars do, spiked the size of government and created some bureaucracies and some precedents that were later picked up and made much bigger around World War I. But we had a relatively liberal country, obviously minus the issue of slavery, which all libertarians throughout history have condemned. But I think what happens is that, and this is another element of progressivism, and I think it's hugely important, and it's been written about as a concept, but I don't know if it's really been specifically applied to progressivism. The progressive is a utopian, and that's a huge problem. And some of the people on the far left are also utopian, but I think your run-of-the-mill, let's tinker around and make government bigger to solve this particular problem, is utopian. So even though the relatively laissez-faire free market economy caused tremendous benefits in increases in living standards, and this is some of this work is cited in the book. The progressive is a utopian and thinks, well, we can do better than that. We can sort of help this progress along faster. I guess hence the term progressive in the sense of we support progress. So around the time of 1900, there was sort of a restlessness, a revolt against these classical liberal ideas that had pretty much reigned through the Grover Cleveland administration. So around World War I, there's a push towards progressive policies. The war itself kind of, I think, aided that in terms of central planning. The Federal Reserve comes in, the income tax comes in around 1914. The drug war, oddly enough, a lot of people think Nixon started it. That's not true. It was started under Woodrow Wilson, the uber progressive, whose picture's on the cover. So there are theories that some of this influence came over from some professors in Germany who kind of came from a sort of a bigger government philosophy and came here and took over some of the grad schools. That's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I allude to some of that in the book. But that's basically, I think basically what happened is that progressivism is really a reaction to libertarianism not accomplishing all the goals fast enough that progressives thought should be attained. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons for the shift. And really since then, really since Woodrow Wilson, it's been a progressive big government model with very little. During the Harding-Coolidge administration, there was kind of a respite and government didn't really grow, but they didn't fundamentally change the trajectory. And then the Depression and FDR came along, and then that sort of big government growth of World War I, which Robert Higgs in his excellent books have pointed out that it's a ratchet effect. A crisis caused government to get bigger, and it gets way bigger. And then after the crisis, it shrinks a little bit, but it's way bigger than it was before. So if you look at a chart of like federal spending before and after World War One, it's significantly bigger after World War One, even though Harding Coolidge reduced some of that military spending. And the same with the New Deal and the Great Society and these other sort of ratcheting up of progressivism ever since then. So that's,
The Gold Newsletter is proudly sponsored by Inventa Capital Corporation, a venture capital advisory firm dedicated to the acquisition and development of assets in the natural resource sector. Today, Inventa is one of the premier mining groups with a first-rate portfolio of companies and a world-class team.
Hi, I am Brian London, and I'm conducting this week's CEO interview with one of the CEOs from Inventa Capital Corp. Inventa Capital, of course, is the sponsor of the Gold Newsletter podcast. Very happy to have back with us this week Chris Donaldson, CEO of Outback Goldfields. Recent recommendation in Gold Newsletter. I am personally a shareholder because I am personally very excited about the story. It's an area play in a region that is one of the hottest exploration regions in the world today. The renowned legendary Victoria Goldfields of Australia that was reinvigorated in recent years. Chris, it's amazing to me, and it was amazing to me when I first heard the Outback story, that you were able to get into this area play with really a commanding property position long as after it was already in play and a lot of land had already been snapped up. Can you explain how that all, refresh our memories on how that all came about?
Yeah, sure, Brian. Thanks for having me on again, and welcome back to the office here. So, so we relatively new company. I came on in October, and we were able to acquire 4 properties in and around the Fosterville mine that Kirkland Lake owns. Of course, that is a legendary mine. They hit a zone called the Swan Zone. They're mining at 50 gram per ton, and so it's made them the highest grade, highest margin mine in the world. So it restarted a staking rush there. The history, of course, of Victoria or the Victorian goldfields in Australia is from 1850 to 1920. There was a massive gold rush, and it made Victoria and Australia the richest country in the world. And then it was relatively inactive, or at least there wasn't a lot of success until this big discovery. So there's been a staking rush that's going on. And we were able to get 4 properties from a publicly listed company called Petrotherm in Australia. And that was basically through the relationship that Craig Perry, our chairman, who many of you might know as chairman of Vizsla and Skeena Resources and a lot of others, he's Australian, knew the financial backers of Petrotherm. And they saw what other companies have done with similar land packages on a Canadian or North American market, and had a lot of success. So they wanted these assets run by Craig and his team, which I'm happy to be a part of now, and also on a North American market. So we're currently listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange under OZ. We've listed on the OTCQB under OZBKF. We're hoping to uplist to the TSX Venture here in the next couple of weeks as well. So how did we get the properties? It was through that relationship. The benefit is that the head geologist there had the foresight to acquire these 5 years ago. And so it's allowed them and now us to have first mover advantage. Never in my wildest dreams would I think I'd be able to acquire these properties today with the amount of interest that's going on in the area.
Yeah, second or third mover gaining a first mover advantage is one way to look at it. And it's in a commanding, as I say, commanding property position in the area. And it gives you 2 paths toward share price appreciation. One, if any of your neighbors in the area, other landholders, make a similar discovery to Fosterville, then all of the players increase. And we've seen this happen many times in the junior mining game and area plays. And I want to remember that to go back to that, to discuss that, because that's starting to happen as we've just seen. But also exploring your own properties. You have ramped up exploration, a couple of drills now on Glenfine, mobilizing drills to another property. Can you update us on your exploration plans, which we're all very excited to see now come into play?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 4 properties. 2 of them are subject to what we're calling phase 1 exploration. And the first property that we're working on is Glenfine. Glenfine has 2 areas that we're drilling on. The first is Glenfine South, and it's centered around a historic mine that had over 40,000 ounces at 16 gram per ton. So obviously some mineralization there, and recent drilling by our predecessors a few hundred yards away hit another area called Reef 2. We are basically drilling in between to see if we can expand on the Glenfine South mine, see if there's some continuity between the 2 deposits, we'll call it there. So that'll be the first set of results that we get out. We're hoping those come out by the end of the month here. Like everywhere, the assay labs are a little bit inundated, especially with all the exploration that's going on in that area. But we're keen to get those results and see what we have there. And as mentioned, we have 1 diamond drill that's been going. It's done about 2,000 meters of the 4,000 planned on Glenfine. We've added a second RC rig, which is starting to do some lower cost drilling in the area as well. And so we'll finish up at Glenfine South here in the next week or so, and then move up to British Banner. British Banner had some pretty good intercepts, in the recent past here in the last 3 to 5 years, where some mineralizations hitting, a meter or 2 at 10 gram per ton. We're going to do some step out drilling and also drill a little bit more along the basal contact there as well. So that'll start in the next couple of weeks as well. And that's our Glenfine project. And we're now ramping up or preparing to ramp up at our northernmost project, which is Ewangroon. And we did some geophysics. I think I talked about that last time I was on. And we've just completed a LiDAR study that's a survey that allows you to see where the historic workings are. And we're centering around an area off of the Avoca Fault, and that this is the main fault that separates the Bendigo and Stall zones, where most of this mineralization and people are exploring. And we're centering around an area called Golden Jacket, and that is a mine that historically it was at 250 gram per ton they mined, albeit only 1,400 ounces, and then they hit cover. So we're going to run a RAB survey, some RAB drilling on that, 400 holes to really, it's for target generation. So that in combination with the LiDAR and the geophysics, hopefully will identify some prime targets for us for the drill program. So that'll summarize our phase 1, which should take us till about July. And then we'll take a step back, see what we have, and what targets we have, rank and prioritize them. And then we'll also have the exploration license on our other 2 properties, and then deploy whatever amount seems necessary for our phase 2. So roughly about $3 million going into the ground in phase 1, and $3 million on the back half of this year in phase 2. And of course, we were relatively well financed here. We raised $11 million, so we have more than enough to take us through our exploration program this year.
That's a great point. You are very well financed, and it will be a very aggressive exploration program on a number of properties in one of the hottest areas in the world, of course. And as I alluded to earlier, some of your neighbors are actually starting to get some good results now. So the whole area play now is ramping up. Do you see that having an impact on your evaluation anytime in the near future?
Yeah, I hope so. A few things will have to kind of happen for that. So certainly having a gold tailwind helps, and I think we're poised for a pretty good breakout here.
I agree.
You're seeing a lot of some positive news, and certainly all the underlying factors for gold price appreciation are there. It's just there's a bit of disconnect, as we all know, between that price and share price. But if we can have some good results, our neighbors have some good results, I think we're going to see a good little run here. And there's a lot of activity that's going in the area. The knock on the area is that Fosterville is a phenomenal mine, but is there another one? And that's what we're hoping to find. And just in the last week or 2, there's a company called Mandalay Resources, who are about 6 miles south of our Silver Spoon property and about 12 miles south of Fosterville. We're kind of direct line in between, and they just hit a meter at 450 gram per ton. I think 23 grams over 6 meters. So there's a buzz right now that maybe we have a second Fosterville type deposit that's going on in the area. They certainly had a good little bump on that, and good news for any of us is good news for all of us.
Yeah, and it's important to note that you do have the entire area was known for really high grades, and some of the mines that were present on your properties are known for really eye-popping grades, gold grades. So that's very exciting, and also hopeful, adds hope that there is another Fosterville in the area, and things are all starting to point that way. Great to have news coming up. I'm an excited shareholder to see the results coming in and over the next weeks to come, days and weeks to come. Chris, thanks so much for updating us today.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, and I want to just emphasize that point that we are living or have lived for the past year through precisely one of these overblown crises that will, permanently change or expand the scope of government. And this one has scared me, basically, I have to be honest, about the way that it has just spread like wildfire in terms of the way that the paranoia or fear about this virus has caused countries such as my home country to basically block themselves off from the world for over a year. It's crazy. And like I said, it is a ratchet effect. So that, we've had basically at least a century of this, not hegemony, but very dominant mindset in the United States. And you're trying to communicate to people what this actually is. And aside from progressivism or this mindset, just ignoring cost, let's say, the cost of Social Security or the cost of government education, and just thinking just because it's a natural right or whatever, it just has to be done no matter what the cost is. Why do you say it's destroying America? What aspects of this country do you see as eroding away on account of progressivism?
Well, when my ancestors came over from Europe about 1900, you have basically no federal welfare state. Aside from the Spanish-American War, there wasn't really much of a imperial impulse of later years. I think the government spent maybe 10% of your income. You hardly had any contact with the federal government except for the delivery of the mail. And now, 100 years later, the government's involved in everything. And when I went to law school, and I'll give you the date because it's relevant, 1983, I took a course from Henry Mark Holzer, who was Ayn Rand's attorney at one point, to give you a little libertarian history in there. And he said on the first day of class, 1983, name some aspect of life that the government's not involved in. And nobody really could. They tried, but he sort of shot them down. Somebody would say, well, going to the bathroom, no, the government regulates toilets, whatever the example was. I'm just sort of using that as an illustration. Now, government is vastly bigger. It's grown vastly in the last year. So it's not the same country. We've completely abandoned the concept of a government limited to protecting rights that Jefferson spoke of. But these aren't just theoretical considerations. I cite a number of facts at the beginning of the book because I know people will be skeptical, just about sort of social decline, the decline in health, the obesity epidemic in America, which I actually tie into progressive policies, and people may dispute that, but at least I make the argument. The breakdown of the family, racial unrest, and this is what I kind of hit on. And I said, race relations, and I'm writing the book in 12, 13, and 14. I noticed that race relations were really suffering, and I kind of explained that in the book. In the 1960s, on my working class street, there was no mother with young children with a full-time job. And the word daycare, we didn't know if you flow me back in a time machine, what's daycare? You asked me when I'm 10 years old. I don't know what daycare is, never heard of it. There weren't any daycare. So now we've got two people working, basically the second, whoever the second breadwinner is probably paying the rough amount of the total household taxes. And then 7% of their income for daycare. They drop their kids off at 3 months old at a daycare center. So there's been a tremendous change in the country, a tremendous decline in the country. I think it's palpable. It's not the same country that I was born into, and I'm was many years post New Deal. But the country's changed drastically, even in the last 50 years, and I think it's we're a very troubled country. I think that's obvious just from watching the news.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. And as you say this, many different issues come to mind. It is a different country, and oh man, I lost my train of thought. But we observe this, like you said, the change in, yes, the scope of government has changed, the values have changed. There's an excellent book by Charles Murray. People can disagree with it to some degree. There's a lot of data in there, but Coming Apart. And I wrote a review, How the Divided States of America Came Apart. And that touches precisely on your issue about how there are different countries within the United States based on demographic characteristics. And so we identified this mindset has accompanied maybe a fraying of the country, a dividing of it, and not just dividing, but it's almost like a division within forced conformity, because many people forget that even though the federal government isn't actually leading everything, they have so many tools at their disposal to make the states do what they want. So whether it's speed limits or employment insurance or Medicaid or Medicare, whatever, they will basically manipulate the states into doing what they want. And so the federalism of past decades or centuries is really on the ropes. Now, yes, you've identified this, and I'm particularly concerned because it is on the run, just sweeping through the private sector, right? Even a field like finance, which is one of the last havens of meritocracy, right? Very quantifiable, very merit-driven. Even that is becoming beholden to this progressive mentality of using companies to somehow socially engineer, many different issues. So by writing a book about it and identifying it, and now we observe this mentality, how on an individual basis should we respond to it, right? So let's say we are concerned about it, we really admire America, and I know many of our listeners are big, proud Americans. What can they actually do to push back against this, aside from reading your book, which is great? What's the action plan from Jim Ostrowski?
Well, I have a bunch of ideas, but there's a couple big ones. You have to understand, I've been in politics since I was a teenager because my father was a judge, and up in New York, they run for office. So he actually ran 7 times when I was either a child or a young man, and often I was, campaigning with him. So I've also run for office a couple of times. I've managed campaigns. I've observed the political scene. So I know everybody's first instinct is to say, well, let's get some better candidates in there. Let's run for office. Let's lobby the state legislature. The problem is that the system is rigged. And I explained this in the book, and actually in a prior book about government schools. In fact, in that book, we had some school board elections yesterday, and I pointed out in that book, which was written a couple of years before Progressivism, that the school board elections are rigged because nobody votes, and most of the people vote are connected with the schools, the teachers unions, and so on. And I looked at the local paper yesterday, a few hundred people in these very large school districts vote. So there's a problem that political scientists have identified. It's called rational apathy or rational ignorance, which is people will not get involved in the political process because they're unlikely to prevail against what I call the political machine, which monetizes their control of the government. So some of these people are making like $100,000, and their job is to go out and get petition signatures, put up signs, campaign, have rallies. that's part of their job. And then if you ask somebody in the private sector who's usually making less because of, among other reasons, because of the burden of paying for the $100,000 government worker, now when they volunteer, they have to just take time out of their leisure time and spend money on gas and other things and food while they're campaigning. So the incentive structure means that the political machine will almost always prevail. There's exceptions where you can rouse up a tremendous amount of emotion, or, in the case of Trump, Trump came in with a lot of advantages. He had almost universal name recognition. He had a certain amount of money of his own, and he happened to be a great communicator. He was a successful TV performer. So that almost is the exception that tests the rule, as Francis Bacon would say. But generally speaking, it's rigged. So what I try to do, and in my first book along these lines, was we all know about the public school. I call it government school. Why not? That's what it is. That the government schools are pretty awful. And we've spent 50 years trying to reform them, and school choice and this and that and merit pay and all this other nonsense. None of it works. So I wrote that book. And I said, look, just take your kids out of these places. And I understand that it's a little bit more money, but you can sort of game the system by moving to a jurisdiction which has lower property. Up here, the schools are paid through property taxes. So, for example, we send our kids to Catholic school. We live in the city of Buffalo, which for reasons that are kind of irrelevant, has a much lower property tax. So why move out to the suburbs, pay the high property taxes when we're not going to use them anyway? So homeschooling, I also recommend. So what direct action means is that it's like, what can you do today to increase your liberty or improve your situation? Because you still, even if you send your kids to private school, you still got to pay the property taxes, but at least you're getting a better product. So the difference between direct action is you're doing it yourself today, at least in some small way. You're making your life better and often shrinking the burden of government on you. And politics is you're trying to convince other people. You're trying to convince the state legislature. You're trying to convince a judge. I've had a case pending. I hope I don't get in trouble here. I've had an anti-lockdown challenge pending for a year. And I understand the judge is busy. The federal court's busy. They're not lazy people. But it's a year. And what can I do? I can go to the Second Circuit in New York City, which is the building you see on a lot of the TV cop shows, and have him order the judge to rule. It's all that's going to do is piss everybody off, and I'll probably get a bad ruling. So it's when I'm deciding I'm going to pull my kids out of a government school and send them to homeschool, Catholic school, or some other private school, that's something I don't need anybody's permission to do. That's direct action. The other sort of biggie there, and I'm working on this project and hopefully have the website up and running soon, is voting with your feet. Now, I like to call, regular voting, voting is like trying to stop a hurricane with your breath. I mean, I've been voting my whole life. I've never accomplished a thing. But there is a great study called Freedom in the 50 States by a friend of mine and PhD, Jason Sorens, and his partner. And they rank the states by freedom. And there's tremendous differences in the degree of freedom you have. And some of the states that people would be saying, well, I think I'm going to go to blank state. I think you better check the rankings because there's better states than that. But what I'm trying to do is sort of fine tune that down to the county level. And I do actually have a list of the 100 freest counties, and I'm actually going to hopefully expand that down to the town level. So, but basically that's another, I think, really important example of direct citizen action. Like I live in New York, which is the least free state. If I vote with my feet to say Indiana, which is a fairly highly ranked state in terms of liberty, I can, just with my one vote, drastically improve my life. Up here, I'm in the U.S. Supreme Court, oddly enough, next week. trying to get in there anyway to challenge the New York pistol permit law, where it takes like 2 years to get a permit. It's very onerous. If I moved, for example, to Tennessee, they just passed constitutional carry. So with my one vote of moving to Tennessee, I've changed my gun laws. And there's other examples I list in the book that are also important, but I think those are the two main ones, because it's
education and moving with your feet.
Yeah, because although the public school movement predates the formal progressive era, it is a progressive idea, and it was recognized at the time. And really, in my book on that subject, I go in. Murray Rothbard wrote a great monograph on it too, which I quote extensively. But one of the main goals of the public school movement was to sort of get students to love the government and love the state. And I have a whole section on propaganda in that book, and I think it's only gotten worse with leftism sort of superimposed on the pre-existing progressivism. I mean, the things the kids are learning in schools now, it pretty much almost guaranteed to produce a bunch of left-wing progressive Democrats. And if you look at the polling numbers, I think that's what you're seeing. So the withdrawing from the schools is absolutely essential. And in one way to sort of one of the things that Jason Sorens and his partner, whose name escapes me, I apologize to him, they rank as educational freedom. And there are states where you can get more educational freedom. I think Indiana is good, but check that out before you rely on that. That's just an example. So those are the two big things. And if I flip through my book, I mean, just education in itself is as the people listen to your podcast are doing, is really a form of direct citizen action. Because if you, as Rothbard, I think, would like to say, if you de-bamboozle yourself or the public, or help other people to come along to the benefits of liberty and so on in the free market economy, you're less likely to be sucked into the machine of progressivism.
Yeah, man, there's so much I want to say about that, Jim, and we're really out of time.
Sorry for talking too much.
Yeah, there years ago, and you probably remember the guy called, oh man, his name escapes me right now. The John Silber, the president of Boston University and candidate for governor of Massachusetts. He was my mentor back in college.
Oh, wow.
And he recommended Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens, which is about a century ago. A reporter, a journalist, went around to various cities in the United States and basically documented the graft, or the grift, if that's the right word, that was going on. The grift and the way that political outsiders would try and make these grandiose entries and almost without exception fail. And like you said, be defeated by the machine. And then on the flip side, a more positive note is the one by Harry Browne, and I'm sure you are familiar with him.
Yes,
and his book,
just a friend of mine.
yeah, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. And Harry Browne was a man who had a profound impact on me back as a college student in the mid-2000s. And he passed away about 2006. I can't remember now. Yes. But his book and his show, if anyone can find those, they also emphasize this direct citizen action. Now, there's another website I want to mention, liberalismunrelinquished.com, which is also a promoter of referring to liberalism as liberalism.
Yes.
Just as we liberalize markets,
right,
or we liberalize trade, it means opening up or freeing those things. So the classical version of the term, people can sign a petition there actually, or put their names to say, we will not use the term liberal in an adulterated or bastardized fashion.
Sure.
Now you're on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
Yes.
And your Facebook is just Liberty Movement, correct?
I've got a personal page, which is somewhat more active. I also have libertymovement.org Facebook page. The website is down for maintenance. It'll be up shortly. I just took a quick cheat into the book. One other really important example of direct action, oddly enough, is jury nullification, where particularly on a grand jury in the states that have it, which is most of the states, you can, if you got a sort of an imaginary crime, it's funny because Jefferson used the term like imaginary crime in the Declaration. I was just reading it this morning. If you get somebody charged with like possession of a semi-automatic rifle and not a crime, it's an imaginary crime, you don't have to indict. So actually, even though that's sort of a governmental thing, it is direct action because one person on a trial jury or a few people on a grand jury can with their own direct action, protect liberty and deter further prosecution. So there's other examples in the book that are discussed in detail of direct action.
Jim, thanks for giving your time. And people should check out your own YouTube channel where you've done lots of videos explaining your views in more detail. And get his book. Progressivism is not going away anytime soon. So there's plenty to learn about it. And otherwise, just thank you for your time. And we look forward to having you back again in the future.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
Cheers.